Welcome to ThomasTalks. ThomasTalks is a series of, relaxed conversations, but hopefully revealing ones, where we meet face to face and discuss pertinent, important issues around human resource matters with leading academics, practitioners from the world of occupational psychology. I'm Amir, Chief Exec of Thomas International. I'm here today with Craig Howells, also from Thomas International, and Miles Henson, from a company we work very closely with called the People Academy. Craig, Miles, would you like to introduce yourselves?
My name's Craig and I'm the Inside Sales Manager at Thomas International. I've been at Thomas just coming up to 5 years now. I've worked from an entry-level position at Thomas within the sales team and have slowly built up a sales team over the last couple of years to become what is now a major part of the UK sales function within Thomas. I am part of the millennial generation, so as well as managing a team that are from the same generation, so I'm hoping to provide a different perspective on today's webinar and give my personal viewpoint itself.
Thanks, Craig. I'm Miles Henson, one of the founders and directors of People Academy. We're a UK-based organisation working internationally, and I guess we specialise in anything that's to do with people in both business and sport, in areas such as leadership, organisational development, coach development, anything really that's got anything to do with the way that people behave and communicate with each other through diversity or generational stuff. And we have worked closely with Thomas for a number of years now, working with them, with our clients, using their products.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig. Thanks, Miles. So let's get into this. So the topic of today's podcast is future-proofing your future leaders. And today we're going to talk about two things, two sides of the same coin really. The first is developing and motivating younger employees in the context of age diversity. Really that's talking about our future business leaders, I guess. And the second is, and with that, the challenges of managing a multi-generational workforce for the first time ever, making sure we're developing and motivating everyone. We all bring different perspectives to these topics, I'm sure that we'll all agree. But Craig, you're one of the youngest managers at Thomas at present, a young leader as I would describe you. What do you think is key to motivating and developing younger employees in our business?
It's a really interesting question, and it's one that quite a few of my clients actually ask me quite regularly, especially more recently with new younger people coming into their organisations. And we know from what we do it's really difficult to generalise what motivates anyone, because as we know everyone is different and we can help to identify what that is through profiling. But from my personal experiences, when talking to friends, peers, team members, the only aspect that seems to come up over and over again is particularly culture. Speaking to friends, it's often the topic of conversation. This place is a really good place to work, or I'm really enjoying my organisation because they give us this back. It's a great culture. I enjoy it. It's always when they say I like getting up in the morning and going to work. And again, you can see that with some of the most successful companies in the world, sort of doing this to attract and retain talent within their organisations. Alongside that, we also see sort of the Generation X to be the first generation to really value the work-life balance as a whole. Therefore, offering flexibility to young people around their work schedules is a great motivator for especially my generation and younger generations as well. And ultimately will be fundamental, especially for the new generations coming in, which is the Generation Zers, I believe, which are fast approaching the workforce.
So lots of varied generations you're talking about there, but you as a leader, what have you found to be one of your biggest challenges, being a young leader, managing, I would guess, a fairly young workforce as well?
Yeah, the main challenge I find being a young leader myself and having a young team is actually the communication between senior management, myself and then my team. The filter is really important because it can change, especially the wording, the way people like to be communicated to, from say senior management, which may be part of is completely different, say 2 generations higher than what I'm actually giving it to below me. And this is often seen when I take time away from work. Messages get lost within communications, especially when I'm away. And then when I come back, it's really easy to then put it back in line and understand whereabouts it's going, really.
And Miles, what do you think about that?
Well, it's really interesting, Amir, listening to Craig there, because I think from a practical point of view, as an organisation, we get to work firsthand with businesses around the world who are living and breathing the sort of things that Craig was talking about. And I guess one case study that comes to mind, and I guess people listening out there will this will resonate with them, that there's a large automotive organisation that we've worked with for a number of years now, who figured out, I guess for want of a better phrase, that they had a group of managers, leaders within their business that were 2 or 3 generations above what was becoming the emerging sort of workforce in there. And they asked the question, was this group of people, did they really understand what was required to recruit, develop and retain different generations of workforce coming through the business? And the answer clearly was no at the time, because it was very hierarchical, it was very traditional. You got through the business, or you got promoted through the business because you'd been there a long time, not necessarily because you were good enough, and those types of things. And they realised that needed to change, because if they were going to stay at the forefront of their industry, then their employees were going to do the same. So they spent a lot of time over the last 4 or 5 years helping the managers, if I could say, who were maybe Generation X or maybe even older Generation Ys, figuring out what it is that the younger generations want from them as a leader, as a manager coming through the business. And that could be anything from being more flexible in terms of the way that they were working with them, how they worked, where they worked. So they got rid of all the desks and created hot desk policy. Set hours went out the window. The way that they dressed changed as well. But I think what they got right was this balance, because it isn't always about making sure that you're just working towards the younger generation. They needed to keep the older generations happy as well. So they kind of bought into that balance of between the experience that the older generation have plus the new dynamism of what the younger generations are bringing to the business. And it has made a significant difference to the way that they do business.
So Craig, one of the things I've noticed with your team is that you're very apt and capable with getting them together on a regular basis, talking to them as a group, and also working with them on a one-on-one basis. I think one of the particular call-outs for me that I've seen is some of the quiz stuff you do, and bringing some fun into it. Just tell us a bit more about how that works with this particular group of people that you have, the team.
Yeah, so the one thing that I found is very key across any organisation is any generation, not organisation, is everyone still values face-to-face contact, even though there's a vast array of different levels of sort of technology or people using technology across all generations. Everyone does still really invest into the face-to-face contact element. And one thing that I try and keep people engaged is, rather than using the traditional way of learning, so sending people in front of a computer or a textbook to go through and say this is how it's going to work, actually having more involved, fun sort of tasks to get people engaged, and sort of touching on the different generations, how they're working, how they can learn, and do it quite a little bit differently. So again, sometimes we do this via the use of technology, so it can be people who are based at home or are working from home that day, or people who are actually in the office, and actually using that and having a different way of learning for them, especially within say key things that we need to learn about our assessments as a whole.
So social media has moved on, as we all know, and as generations have grown up. And what you tend to see now is very much more a process of people sat on their phones, at their desks, as well as on their phones, on their computers, and really multiple uses of technology at the same time. So it's interesting to hear that you're managing to drag these people away from those devices, because quite frankly, if it was anything like my family around the dinner table, I don't actually get a say in anything. We're all sat there with our phones, me included. So it's interesting to gather some more pace around how you separate people from those devices to get them to talk to each other. And as you get there, have you experienced a situation yet where you've got multiple generations that you're working with, or is this still a very new thing in terms of having a younger workforce? And if you did have, older and a whole mix of generations in your team, how do you think you'd handle that?
Yeah, so one thing to touch on there very quickly is the use of how people are switching between work and home life at this moment in time. As we come through the generations, it's becoming blurred. And for the first time, I'm now receiving people who are giving or showing me characteristics of the new generation, which is the generation Z coming through. I've got an individual who started in my team only 6 months ago. All of a sudden, she's got her work emails on her personal phone. She's answering emails at the weekend, and this is someone who's in their first job ever. So there's sort of the the way in which they approach their work as a home work-life balance is become very blurred, and they do this multitasking, which can appear as a stereotype from older generations to then being lazy or not focusing on their work. But what you're finding is they're actually multitasking 10 times quicker than I would be able to do, flitting between personal work throughout the day. Now, working with, that's one key issue, especially working with a cross-generational, is to understand the differences between different generations and get away from these stigmas and stereotypes that have been set previously. I'm sure we're going to go through a couple in the podcast itself, especially around millennials and entitlement and laziness, which seem to be a real hot topic at this moment in time. So I'm sure we'll talk about those a bit later on.
I have a great real example of that, Amir, which Craig and I have spoken about before, but the son of a colleague of mine was at a job interview, and he's a millennial, and he was at a job interview, and the interview seemed to go fairly well. And he got home, and his father said to him, "How did it go?" And he said, "It's all right, Dad, except for they asked me this most ridiculous question." And he said, "What was that ridiculous question?" He said, "They asked me where I saw myself in 5 years' time." He said, "How on earth do I know where I'm going to be in 5 years' time?" And the reason I mention that, because I think that's quite interesting for people of maybe mine and your generation, Mia, because we've grown up in the environment where you need to plan ahead and you need to see your future. But I don't believe, and you probably back me up on this, Craig, that certainly Generation Z coming through really think like that anymore.
No, not at all. Especially being probably the first generation to be connected to so much information from a young age. They're constantly comparing themselves to what's out there. So how someone can tie themselves down for a long period of time, that's almost what they're looking at. Yeah,
and I think it's hard for employees, therefore, to get that right. I think creating the right environment that's acceptable, that's the right way to behave or to work, I think is a really difficult thing to do.
Can I just come in there? I think, what we tend to do here is almost make some mystique and greyness and fog around how we categorise humans in the current day. We're talking about millennials, we're talking about Generation X, we're talking about Generation Y, Generation Z, who knows what it's going to be next. How do you both feel that how do you make that simpler for people to really understand?
Well, I think to really simplify it, I go back to the days when I was much younger and I was growing up and listening to my parents and people around me, and they would sort of label me, "Oh, you can't do that, and that's not the way to behave, and that's not how the world is done," etc., etc. And actually, looking back, there was nothing right or wrong with it. It was just how the world was moving at pace and things were changing. So I think it's moving even quicker now, and it's harder for organisations to almost let go of the old way of doing things. But I think there is a danger. I think probably what you're hearing to here, there's a danger of putting people in boxes and giving them a label, because I think there's much more at play than the fact that I was born in 2010 than I was born in 1960. I think there's a whole personality thing behind that. There's a parental thing. There's a way that you see the world. So I think I think just because someone was born in the year 2000, you can't pin them into a box. You probably think that's fair, Craig.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking at people as a whole, especially within my team, who range in age from 21 to 28. There's such an array of different personalities, and you could slot them into different boxes of generations, even though they're 10 years apart in age. So it's really important not to make an assumption on people and to have that conversation first, and if you can, get a platform in which you can understand where their motivations lie, and also get more information about them before obviously making that stereotypical viewpoint of them. So
I'll give a really practical example. I would work with an 18-year-old, for instance, and one would come and shake my hand and ask me how I am, and the other one would go, "Huh?" Right? Just shows that they're the same age, the same group, but actually behave very, very differently. And I think there's more to it than just putting them in a box, if you like.
So as we look at retaining young employees with companies, and there's a lot of talk and trend about currently in the marketplace is that we work across tenure and how long people are staying at companies. If you look at the multi-generational workforce, that's clearly going to bring some different challenges to us, and and look at the value and how long they will stay. Miles, have you worked with any customers who are looking at these kind of issues, and how are they addressing them?
Yeah, we have, and the answer is in lots of different ways, which I guess is the right answer. But so I think the organisations that seem to be have their finger on the pulse, if you like. They're already starting to think about building and promoting a learning environment that's conducive not only to attracting and training but retaining people. But it doesn't matter whether you're 55 or 25, they're thinking about it now. They're starting to create an environment around that means that both groups will want to stay. At a very high level, there's some organisations that we work with that actually are working on strategic visions for that. So coaching and developing different generations of people. So it isn't just left up to the line manager or the supervisor to figure out what needs to happen. They have a strategic vision at a very, very high level. And I think that the thing that we see a lot of is this, we call it sharing skills and experience. So let's say the younger generation may be more techie. It's a sweeping sentence, I know, but potentially could be more techie, and the older generations may have much more experience and think slightly differently. Organisations are now looking at how do they get the right mix between those two different types of generation, and how can one learn from the other, and vice versa. So, and then there are things like a phrase we call fondly emerging leaders. So organisations are now starting to think about what does future leadership look like, and what skills does that future leader need to have in the next 5, 10, 15 years or whatever it is. So they're looking almost at what they currently have within the organisation. They're trying to plan ahead to think what does futureship look like in my leadership, look like in my business, and therefore trying to then develop the individuals that are much younger so they're in a place and they're ready to go when an opportunity arrives. In other words, they don't want to make the same mistakes, dare I say, that some of the older generation are making. And there are a number of organisations out there that we work with that are proactively thinking about this right now. So there isn't a promise of a leadership job or a management job, but there is a promise that will develop you so you've got the right skills and the right way of thinking, so therefore you can manage people in the future. And actually, if you ask someone in a sort of a millennial or a Gen Z generation, they want development almost more than a great salary. So it works all ways around.
So Craig, one of the interesting things that I'm seeing recently, especially around recruitment across the multi-generational workforces that we deal with, is as you look at the younger end of the workforce, the decision-making process and timing behind it, when you go from application or wanting to be considered for a job to actually getting a job, and certainly in the internal telesales type of environment, some of the things that I'm hearing and seeing are that these candidates move really quickly, and the minute they latch onto something, they're on it. Is that something you're experiencing, and if it is, how are you dealing with that?
Yeah, so this is an issue we're actually dealing with only a couple of weeks ago, really. We are working with a recruitment company itself, alongside ourselves, who partner with us to fill quite a few of our upcoming positions that we have available within my team, because we're expanding quite rapidly. Now, what we're finding is, because these individuals are in a situation where they can contact so many different recruiters, companies, all at the same time with a touch of a button now, that there's hundreds of people looking at these CVs all the time. The only way I can relate it is almost to the renting market. If anyone's ever actually rented a house before, these houses get snapped up overnight, and it's really similar to candidates themselves. So we've had to rethink how we're doing or our timing around our recruitment process and how we're doing it, and we've actually had to almost flip it on its head and actually bring the assessment centre forward even a month, just to try and get these guys in as soon as possible so they can actually buy into the company. Because we're finding actually we're having to sell ourselves as a company to candidates before they even sell themselves to us. They have to buy into what they feel to be a great company to work for. And once they're then invested, when we've got that hook, they then will come back to us and actually spend the time on us. And whereas historically it may have been flipped over, whereas companies could have a pick of anyone who they wanted to previously, probably in the last 20, 30 years or so, and candidates really had to sell themselves into organisations. So I think it's actually a flip. The power's in the candidates' hands now.
And Craig, may I ask a question? Do you think that pace thing has come about as a result of social media and the way the world is changing, and the fact that the younger generations now want things more instantaneously?
Yeah, absolutely. It's technology really that's sped all of this up. It's the willingness that they can actually understand the markets, looking at job opportunities very quickly. And the more that technology improves, the quicker this is actually going to become, which I think is going to be an issue for anyone who's going to be recruiting, because candidates again will be snapped up within days rather than weeks or months now.
It's really interesting. So guys, how do you think we best help these multi-generational workforces? What's key advice that we can give people around what they could be thinking about, what they could be doing to both recruit, retain and develop multi-generational workforces? And do you think it's a good idea?
Yes.
I think it's a crucial idea, and I think a lot of the answer to that is the way in which the people doing the recruiting and the managing and the leading see the world. I think that's vital. I think it starts with them. So I think things like you're going to need to communicate more uniquely in the future than you've ever done before. It isn't one size fits all, never has been. I think you're going to need to be more accommodating in terms of the differences within the workforce and the fact that people need different things. I think, dare I say, you need to create more workplace choices, so it isn't just one track and it isn't you've got to be this or you've got to be that. I think it needs to look and feel different so people can gravitate towards something different. I think it goes without saying, and obviously the work that Thomas do plays into this, that you're going to need a more flexible leadership style than ever before. I think as a what was a leader 10, 15 years ago is not what a leader looks like today, and that's crucial to recruiting and developing a multi-generational workforce. I think the final thing for me to say on that is this idea of respect. I think it's okay to be very creative and have lots of initiatives, which I think the younger generations have, and I think it's okay to say so what and to question things and be more reflective than maybe some of the older generations might be. So I think having that respect for both and finding a way of accommodating and merging the two is really, really important.
And how do you avoid you've got this new, exciting, younger generation of a workforce, and the more experienced, older, dare I say it, workforce don't get left behind and forgotten?
From my experience as a young millennial coming into an organisation itself, at the time, I'm sure you won't mind me saying, was a little top heavy. I remember joining a Thomas, and potentially I was the probably only one or two people under 20 years old or under 30 years old or so. Which has changed radically over the last 5 years or so. But one thing that really helped me was a mentorship across generations. It really helped me to understand what value the older generation has, the experiences I can tap into, the knowledge that a situation I haven't come across before, they know, they've seen it, they've been there. But also it gives me an area to pretty much show and showcase my ability of what I've learned, my technology skills, where we can both benefit each other really. And again, I've still got those mentoring relationships set up to this day, and they still get in touch with me in regards to say Excel or anything to do with computers that they need help with and things like that, and I always go to them for knowledge and experience.
I think what we're talking about here is environment. Environment is key to this, creating the right environment as an employee or a manager or a leader for different age groups to work collaborative together to get the best out of the different skill sets that they bring, and to be aware of it. I passionately believe, Amir, that organisations are now more aware of this subject than they've ever been in the last 20 or 30 years. I think the days have gone where you come in, my son, and you get your head down and work hard for 20 years and you might get promoted. I think, fortunately, those days are long gone.
I think it's true, and I think it's a good point you make, Miles. I think the challenge is still with a lot of organisations that I come across, that they may recognise that the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Yeah.
So the actual doing something about it and moving forward with it is really where they've really got to get on with this rather than just talk about it. So how do we move this forward in terms of, you've got some millennials, you've got some Generation X, Generation Y. How do you gel all these people together? How do you get them thinking about being cohesive as a team?
It's about understanding across all levels in regards to what, again, is their motivations, why are they doing certain things. Just a simple situation of having a conversation as to why someone's doing something can completely change someone's viewpoint. We often catastrophize different situations, especially if people don't have prior knowledge, and people get into a rhythm of thinking in a certain way. So for example, especially with if I think of a particular individual within my team, it almost comes across as this person leaves or comes in on time, leaves bang on time, and comes across as that person who wouldn't go the extra mile, who wouldn't put in the extra time, bit of a clock watcher. But actually getting that situation or those individuals down and talking about it as to why that person does that, you then start to understand why they do it and understand the full picture.
Yeah.
So small conversations like that across teams, generations, can really add some value to that understanding. And especially if we're looking at the change process itself, is not to be scared of it. This is a change process that people need to embrace as we go through it, and embrace knowing more about each other. And there's lots of platforms out there that they can use to do it.
One thing I'd add to that is going back to that automotive organisation I spoke about at the beginning. They create these smaller working groups now, working parties now, where they have a question to be answered or a challenge within the organisation. They create these small working groups, if you like, that are a cross-generational in terms of their age and experience in the business. And you can be on one of those groups if you've been in the organisation 7 days, and you can be in that group, the same person that's been in there 40 years, and they're really encouraging that, because what you then see is each generation is valuable to the other one, and they're cross-sharing ideas. And I think that's a very practical way of starting to deal with some of the challenges that businesses have. Just ask people, and it's very old-fashioned, but just ask them what they think.
So it's all very good us talking hypothetically about, how good we all are, and I know none of us are perfect in this, but when it doesn't go well, when you're dealing with a multi-generational workforce and you have a challenge and it doesn't work out, how do the different generations react to feedback, to you making a mistake as a leader, to companies that you work with, recognising they haven't done something right and pushing the correct button? Because it feels like, when you used to make a mistake as a leader, it would get really looked at in a negative fashion, and it'd be really hard then to turn around that individual. How is that changing?
Especially with younger individuals, there seems to be a stereotype starting around they're very opinionated, they're very confident, they're not afraid of that sort of conflict area, and they're almost, to go back to the point of maybe even entitlement, where people aren't scared to ask those sorts of questions. Now, how to deal with those situations, it is very individualistic to the person and the organisation, really. So it's very difficult to understand. I don't know, Miles, if you've got some case studies of how they've, maybe across generations, have helped each other out.
I think it's a great question, Amir, and the reason it's a good question is because I think I've experienced it where it's worked very well and it's worked very, very badly as well. So starting with the negative, I think experiences where, and I don't want to put people in boxes again, as at the start, but maybe the younger generation are less tied to one employee, one organisation, one way of doing things than maybe the older generations are. So therefore, an example I've seen twice recently is where the millennials have left an organisation because they don't like the way the business is being run, or they're being managed, or they're being developed. But what's more important than that is they've left the organisation without another job to go to, which I think generationally that wouldn't happen 20, 30 years ago. So I think that the days are gone where it's do as I say and do as I tell you, because I'm developing you. I don't think that's acceptable anymore, and I think different generations would challenge you. Where I've seen that work very well, though, is, and it's what Craig said earlier, is where coaching, mentoring relationships in place, where someone of a different generation is struggling with a particular issue or challenge within the business, or needs developing, and they've been put alongside someone with more experience that can help them through that. And normally it's someone who's nothing to do with their part of the business, because they may be this trusting with their own manager, etc. And that's quite an interesting way of approaching it.
Brilliant. Very interesting indeed. So Craig, in your tenure at Thomas, just over 5 years, from a multi-generational perspective, what are some of the key things that, one or two, maybe three key things that you'd highlight around working with a multi-generational workforce that's either helped or hindered?
So my time at Thomas, for potentially a first proper job, has actually gone, as you said, quite a long time, especially for my generation itself. So it's just coming up to 5 years now as a whole. What I think has really helped me is, realistically, I know it's almost tooting our own trumpet, but understanding myself and other people by using our products has really helped me understand individual differences, and actually aided those conversations when I've actually wanted to understand what the difference is between generations. it's not putting people in boxes, because there's people who are my age that potentially you could put them in a box of the baby boomers, for example, because of the way they've been brought up. As you said, the values are completely different, Miles, earlier with the two 18-year-olds. That's one thing that I feel has really kept me in Thomas. The other is the flexibility in the organisation. There's been so much change that has happened over the last 5 years, but I've always felt involved, and the culture of Thomas has been so embracing of that. I'm not afraid to, as I say, when I was first joined Thomas, to sit across the table of yourself, Amir, or Martin Reed when he used to be in the organisation, to actually sit down and have a conversation around my future and what I wanted to do. And it's never a conversation that Thomas ever shied away from, around the development of my pathway and what I wanted to do when I wanted to move away from Thomas even in the future. And it's something that Thomas has embraced as it's moved forward and developed me as an individual. So it's really that value and being valued as an employee is really key for me as to why I stayed. And again, it's around the culture piece, the culture of the business, being valued as an employee, and the relationships you have with people in organisation. That's the one thing I say has kept me here so long.
That's great to hear, Craig, and it's great to see how you're coming on this journey and going through that change as well, and sticking with it. As with any change, it's a challenge. You see Miles every day in the companies that you work for. What would be key in the leaders that you've seen, qualities wise, that come out as they join in and managing this multi-generational workforce?
Yeah, I would say, to pick up on Craig's point, I think you have to start with yourself with these things always, and I think that the leaders that we work with today that seem to be, if the phrase is ahead of the game, if that's the right phrase, have a greater level of self-awareness of the way that they are and the way that they lead and the way they interact with people, but also they spend time to understand that the person in front of them, be it 25 or 55, could be different for them and needs different things. And I think that added into what I mentioned earlier about, I think organisations, if they're not already, should be starting to think about what is their vision, what is their strategic plan for recruiting and developing and retaining different generations as it comes through. Because I don't think many organisations have that level of thought. I think they just keep doing what they've always done, and therefore they get this superstar through the doors, and 6 months later they've gone and no one can figure out why. And that's the worst case example. But so in answer to his question, I think the leaders who have this tremendous level of self-awareness, who have this, we call it people acuity, are able to spot that someone needs something different from them, either because they're 20 years younger or they're just a different personality style, to pick up on Craig's stuff, I think makes a difference. Yeah.
So guys, we're out of time, unfortunately, and I think we could talk about this for at least a few more hours, if not days. It's a really interesting topic, and what the clear takeaway is, it's about thinking, planning, preparing, looking at the recruitment, the retention and development, most importantly, of people within businesses, no matter where they are on the scale of multi-generational workforce. Yeah. So I'd really like to thank you both for your input and your comments today, and your thought and foresight, and I look forward to talking to you again soon on a different subject maybe.
Thank you.